Welcome to True Crime by Indie Drop-In. Each week, we feature an episode from the best independent creators. Hit the subscribe button for more great true crime content. If you would like to help support Indie Drop-In, check out our Patreon at the bottom of the show notes. Today's episode is from Scarlet TCP. Don't forget to check out the show notes for links to subscribe to Scarlet TCP and to follow on social media. Enjoy the show.
Begin.
We're on a roll. So, welcome back, Scarlettos.
Sorry, folks, but we could ramble all day. All right, so let's get back to it. So, Albert Henry DeSalvo, born September 3rd, 1931, in Chelsea, Massachusetts, in and out of trouble with the police from an early age. Not surprising considering his upbringing. We've talked about his father and the challenges he had as a child, the abuse that he suffered. His mom and seeing her abused by the father certainly was some terrible modeling for relationships for the future.
Awful.
He also had some issues, some sexual issues, as he got older that we'll talk about. So there's a lot to, as Brittney says, to unpack about DeSalvo. Albert DeSalvo, born on September 3rd, 1931 in Chelsea, Massachusetts. He had a tough life.
Yeah.
Or at least an early life.
A tough early life, for sure.
He had a brother and a sister, and he's lived with his mother and father. It's said that his father was very, very abusive to not only his mother, but to the kids.
He was an abusive alcoholic. A couple terrible things that he did to, the father did to Albert's mother was broke all of her fingers by snapping them backwards and knocked out all of her teeth.
In front of the kids.
Of course.
Yep. It's said that he really wasn't interested in having the kids around, and at one point sold them off to a farm for $9 and then got them back for some apparent reason.
Yeah, got them back. But before he even did that, he would bring prostitutes home and have sex with the prostitutes in front of the kids.
Yeah.
And, all right, I got to ask you about this. I saw on one of the documentaries I was watching that his father introduced Albert to sex at 7 years old.
That's probably true.
How
introduced sex to him with a prostitute?
That's exactly where I'm going with. I'm not. That's what I don't know. Like,
I wouldn't be surprised if Albert DeSalvo was abused, sexually abused.
That
wouldn't surprise me at all.
That probably happened, and I'm just curious. I unfortunately, as horrible as this is, and this is, I guess, to my positive upbringing, I can't even imagine a 7-year-old being exposed to sex or introduced to sex, as it said.
I can't either. I, like you, it's beyond my comprehension because I didn't ever have to deal with that when I was young.
Right, exactly.
The closest that I can think to anything I've ever heard that included specific details about those kinds of relations with children and with adults was honestly that Leaving Neverland documentary. Oh, yeah. The graphic nature of that documentary, which if you guys haven't seen it, it's about Michael Jackson. The victims, the alleged victims, I'll say, just to leave it open-ended, even though I think it's all pretty clear about what happened. The detail at which they discuss those crimes, and regardless of whether they were true or not, it was just so awful to hear that someone would look at a child like that. Disgusting beyond comprehension. And, obviously there's some mental problems there with a person who would want to have sex with a child.
Yeah,
you've got some real issues. Albert DeSalvo was in and out of trouble at a young age. Not surprising considering the challenges he had at home, the abuse he suffered. I don't think they had a lot of money. Things were a bit tight in Boston, and I think in the area he grew up was not a very nice area. We see 12-year-old DeSalvo first arrested for battery and robbery, at such a young age. I mean,
battery is what really surprised me. Robbery, I feel like, okay, sure, but battery is really something. Well, at 12 years old.
Who did he batter? I mean, he's 12.
That's what I mean.
He's kind of probably a little guy. He wasn't a big guy as an adult.
You know what, actually, one thing that we didn't talk about, and I meant to, so battery, I don't know who he battered. He's a little 12-year-old boy. He was previously, as was mentioned, he was sold into slavery to work on a farm. He and his two siblings for a total of $9 total for all three of them. And when that happened,
oh my God, are you serious?
Yeah,
not each.
No, not each.
Oh, for God's
I know,
sakes.
it's awful.
That's terrible for your self-esteem.
It's awful to well, okay, let alone it's child slavery.
I guess that's an understatement.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Fine.
Big picture here. Sold into child slavery. Or $9 is bad for your self-esteem.
Or $3.
Or $3.
But $9 would be cool. Not really. Just kidding.
So, even before, and I don't think he was actually arrested for any of this, but even before he was arrested at age 12 for battery and robbery, he had a history of torturing and killing animals. Which
Shocker.
Which here is where I really started to see a lot of parallels to our favorite Ed Kemper and the McDonald Triad. Now, I didn't see the other parts of the McDonald Triad, but
all roads lead to Ed Kemper for us. And as we've talked about, there's a good reason behind that, but not because we really like Ed Kemper.
Not because we really like, no. Not
to digress, but we have a absolute fascination with the actor who plays Ed Kemper on Mindhunter. Just to drop that in there in case he's listening.
Yes,
Cameron.
And if you're listening, Cameron Britton, we love that you loved our tweet. All roads lead back to Ed Kemper. Thanks to your amazing portrayal. Yeah, you're right. I'm a kiss ass. I will shill for anything.
We're not creepy about this.
All right. So, 12 years old, arrested for battery and robbery, and sentenced to 11 months into the Lyman School for Boys, which, let's be real, it's juvie.
Yeah.
I mean, that's all it is.
Or what I like to call criminal training camp.
I like that. I hadn't heard that before. That's a good one.
I just made it up.
You're welcome. That's really good.
That's Sonia's little terminology. But it's true. I mean,
it really kind of is.
Prison, jail, those are places where people get better at crime. Unfortunately, there's no rehabilitation happening.
Yeah.
Unless you, which, good or bad, whatever, you find religion. That seems to be the only way that people, lean towards, rehabilitation when they have a bigger purpose. And as we all know, religion gives you that for the most part if you need it.
Or
that's all I'll say.
Or podcasts, because there are a couple of great podcasts that are recorded inside some major prisons.
Oh my God, I love Ear Hustle.
I know. Ear Hustle's
Jesus.
really good. Okay. So he's released from juvie, criminal training camp, after 11 months, and then is arrested again 2 years later at the age of 15 for stealing a car.
Well, I guess that answers my question about him knowing how to drive.
In
Boston, some people didn't have cars, public transportation.
Yeah, but also at the same time, just because he stole a car doesn't mean he knows how to drive.
What do you think?
That might have been how
did he push it?
That might have been how he got caught. He wasn't good at driving. I'm just suggesting.
What year was that?
What year was he born?
He was born 31, so 15
this would have been
years.
about 46.
Oh, well, the fucking car he'd have to drive?
Yeah.
I mean, no power steering, no power brakes. You'd probably have to turn a knob to get it to start. Like, the kind of car in the 40s is not...
I love classic cars. Do you love classic cars? Don't knock classic cars.
I love classic cars, but they're not easy, dude. Like,
they're not easy. Sure. Okay. So he was arrested again at 15 for stealing a car. Next thing I have for him is when he probably made what I think is probably a really good choice by enlisting in the Army at age 17.
Yep. I mean, if you're a young man at that time, he was 17, so that would have been after World War II, right?
Yeah, it actually would have been
46, 47,
right,
48.
Leading right into the Korean War.
Okay, got it. Fair enough. Sure, hey, if you need some structure in your life and there's nothing else out there and you will likely get drafted anyway, you might as well just go in.
Yeah, exactly. I got the impression, and maybe I'm just making this up, though, he kind of took that as a positive step in his life. He thought this is going to give him some structure and somewhat of a purpose and hopefully keep him on the straight and narrow.
Yeah, and I think for a lot of people who are looking for that kind of structure, the military definitely helped. I'm glad that he had at least the foresight to think about that and to try.
For sure.
Whether or not that helped or not, we'll see. We'll discuss.
He served his time and he was honorably discharged. And then he decided to re-enlist again, this time as an Army police surgeon.
Why enlist again when all you have to do is just stay? I mean, isn't like they're career military people, right?
Yeah, there are definitely career military people. I think that when you re-enlist, essentially, I might be totally wrong, so please correct us on Facebook or Twitter if we are wrong. But I think it's kind of like he served his time, maybe wanted to get back to civilian life, maybe couldn't find a career or a job and decided to re-enlist again because he knew he had something that he could go back to.
Got it. So let's talk a little bit about when he met his wife.
Yeah.
Irmgard Beck, who
Right.
he met while he was in the military. She was from Germany.
She was.
So was that during his first or his second round?
I'm pretty sure that was during his second tour.
Okay. I think during his second tour, this is where he had some issues with the military and disobeying orders, if I'm not mistaken.
He was court-martialed for disobeying orders. Though ultimately, I guess it was thrown out, or he wasn't held accountable, and it never really came back to affect him.
Got it. So BTW.
I think I know where you're going.
There was also a situation that I heard about on one of the many podcasts that I listened to. My favorite podcast about this particular crime and the Boston Strangler and DeSalvo, I thought the most informative was the podcast Serial Killers.
Yeah, me too.
I love their format, and they just do a really good job. And while I just really like it. It's my jam. I totally get what they're going for. In this time, it sounded to me like, I guess DeSalvo had gone over to someone's house while he was in the military, and there were young people there. He went there. It sounded to me like this was planned. He went there. There was a young girl there named Lucy. She was 12. And then there was a 7-year-old and a toddler there as well. And he goes in and proceeds to, by the way, I don't know why people are leaving their kids at home by themselves, because Lucy's 12 and she's got these other 2 boys, 2 kids as young as one, so he comes over, he knocks on the door, he talks his way in. I forget what he said, but it was something persuasive. So he's there with these young children. The middle boy takes the toddler to put him in his crib. And at that point, of course, DeSalvo and Lucy were alone.
Yep.
And sounds to me like DeSalvo did some inappropriate touching and got himself into some trouble because Lucy told on him. Rightly so.
Rightly so.
And I'm not sure why. I think she said no, and she, got him away from her. But I don't know what else would have kept him from. Did he just leave or whatever? I'm not sure what happened there.
I don't know.
It's a bit unclear.
This is while he was in the service, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So also while he was in the service, he would boast that he slept with more than 2,000 women.
Yeah, he had a pretty voracious sexual appetite.
Yeah.
But let's go back to Lucy for a second.
Okay, yeah.
Because this is what I find really disturbing and where I'm like, okay, could we have done something about this and sort of stopped this behavior earlier on? It sounds to me like Lucy's mom, at the very least, wanted to press charges at first against DeSalvo. The military police was aware of his actions. And then later, the mother of Lucy then retracted, saying that she didn't want to put her daughter through it. It was embarrassing. Mm-hmm. And so he was actually not tried, for the crime. But the military police knew about it.
Yeah.
So... I mean, I get it when somebody's not, going to press charges, but do you always have to have someone pressing charges before you're found guilty of a crime? I don't know.
Well,
I don't think so.
I don't know about, ultimately...
You're a military police officer.
Well, yeah, you're a military police officer. I don't know how it works in the military. I mean, in the general public, the victim doesn't actually press charges. It's the state or the county that presses the charges.
Right.
Of course, it makes it much more difficult to do when the victim is unwilling to cooperate. And a lot of times when you say, I don't want to press charges, it just means you don't want to deal with it and you're not going to be part of the investigation. And so a lot of times it gets thrown out. I don't know how it works with a court martial and a court a court-martial in the military and a military investigation.
But I guess the reality is if she wasn't willing to testify, and she's a 12-year-old little girl, it was probably traumatic. If, she was the only witness, really, there probably wasn't any case. That sort of disintegrated, but he had some issues. He had some issues in the military. He did meet his wife, Irmgard Beck, again, a girl from Germany. They got married. He, it appears that he really loved her. He felt strongly about her.
Yes,
I don't know if he was abusive to her. They had children together. He was really forthright about his sexual appetite and his inability to be fulfilled by his wife and his marriage to her. And hey, I'm going to say out there, because this guy, I hear this all the time, men and women always use this, I'm not getting enough sex at home, so I'm going to have sex with somebody else. In this circumstance, I think his appetite was more than anybody could have satisfied. And I don't think his sexual appetite was, again, about sex. I think it was about power.
I think it was about power. I want to talk about that a little bit. So it was mentioned, of course, that while he was serving, he met Irmgard in Germany. She moved to Boston with him after he was honorably discharged, even though he was court-martialed. They had 2 children, but I want to first talk about their first child, a daughter, who the official diagnosis was not... I couldn't find it. As far as I know, it wasn't revealed. But the first child, the daughter, was born with a very serious, very rare pelvic birth defect. I have my theories as to what that could be, but that's for another podcast. And it was advised by physicians that Irmgard not have any more children because the future children could be worse than their daughter. So
you think that's true now?
No.
You think, okay, I don't either. I disagree with that, but whatever. I guess it's one way to avoid it potentially happening.
Yes. So,
yikes.
That was a very, very common belief up until 30-ish years ago. But anyway, so the reason that Irmgard knew about Albert's sex addiction, though I don't think it was actually called a sex addiction at that point, but she didn't want to have sex with him, not because she didn't want to have sex with him, but because she was so fearful of getting pregnant with another child who was worse off than their daughter. Now, ultimately, she would become pregnant and give birth to a healthy son later on, but I think that the reason that she tried to avoid him and tried to avoid having a sex life was less about his strong desires and more that she was very fearful of what could happen.
I got it. But they got over that.
They did get over that.
They got over that. Yeah. They had a child. And what I understand, apparently, back in that time, you were told that if you had a child who had issues, the best thing that you could do would be to quickly have another child that would help you get over that. Because until there was some psychosis about you having a child, and until you had a child that was healthy, you would never get over it. Which, I don't necessarily agree with that. But fortunately, there's a lot, better psychological, help and conversations. And you can, that's not the way to achieve that. There are a lot of other ways to achieve that goal as well.
All right. Now after after they're back in the States, back in Boston, making a life for themselves, Albert's first foray as an adult into crime started in 1961.
And how did he do that?
He took on the moniker, or what became the moniker, the Measuring Man, which I think we mentioned this in our Boston Strangler episode.
This is such a great story. I'm going to actually do this.
You can't do this.
Well, this is okay. So I'm gonna say something personal about my boyfriend, who's gonna be really pissed.
Oh, he's gonna love this.
Mm-hmm. But we have a running joke in our house that he is an amateur gynecologist or an amateur breast whatever. He'll give you a mammogram for free, and that's kind of this Measuring Man bullshit that DeSalvo did. Dude, like who falls for this shit?
Well, apparently Boston women in the early 1960s fall for this shit.
Oh
because,
my God.
right,
it's like the worst pickup line in the world. If you go anywhere in LA, some guy wants to measure you. No shit.
So he would go door to door selling something, air quotes, and then a woman, this is great. Like it's so awful and ridiculous. I can't help but kind of laugh at it that people fell for it. So he would go door to door pretending to sell something. Women would open the door and he would be aghast at their beauty.
Jesus Christ.
Oh my goodness.
Ladies, please.
And he would essentially forget about the things that he had to sell because he suddenly became a modeling agent and would ask the women to put on a leotard so he could get their measurements because they were future models.
Why does he want him to put on a leotard? Just be naked. What's the big damn deal?
Well, I think to your point, I think you said before something about being a more conservative time. It's more likely to have a woman is willing to put on a leotard than to get naked for a stranger.
I guess. Leotards are a pain in the ass. I mean, anywho. Okay, so, ma'am, could you please put on the leotard I brought with me? Is that what you're saying? He brought a leotard with him?
I'm actually not sure.
Ma'am, do you have a
Do you
leotard?
have a leotard?
Can you put on a leotard that's right there, and then I'm going to measure you? So here's. I mean, now
he was
I'm
like Sir Mix-a-Lot.
Well, so I'm going to get a little weird here, and don't just
weirder than it's been.
Don't judge. But and please, ladies, don't get offended. Nobody get offended by this. But my guess is
I have to work with you every day.
I know. Okay. Sorry. Well, then I've already offended you many times, so you're used to it. What I will say about this is that, and what DeSalvo says about this in his confession, and I would probably say he's partly right, is this probably worked on many women, unfortunately. And not only did it work on many women, but it sounds to me like he was successful at, having sexual relations with them and, really taking advantage of the situation. It sounds to me like the only people who had a problem with it are the ones who complained, but there had to have been some that did not, have a problem with it and went along with it. He bullshitted his way through it. He achieved what he wanted. Call you later. You're fantastic. I'll put you on my list of models and, go with God. And that's pretty much what he did. But I bet he was pretty successful in some of his attempts.
Oh, he was very successful. And most of the women didn't complain because they thought that they were going to get a modeling contract out of it. It wasn't until months went by and they never heard back from this modeling agent that they started to talk about it and to say something.
Well, here's the other part that I'm just going to be 100% honest about this. Albert DeSalvo was not a bad-looking guy.
No.
He had a decent build. He wasn't, in the scheme of things, he wasn't an ugly guy.
No, he wasn't an ugly guy.
Yeah, and so that probably helped. If he was, a very unattractive man and, he wasn't well kept, this probably wouldn't have worked. But he was charismatic. Mm-hmm. He was a career criminal. He was moderately attractive, and he had an incredibly strong sex drive. So he probably had his, spiel worked out. He probably was good at it. He was probably charming. It was effective. And so,
yeah, it worked.
It worked a lot. And I don't necessarily believe Albert DeSalvo and all of his bragging, because apparently he was known as a braggart. And, nobody would, to me, what I see when I see these people talk about Albert DeSalvo and his correlation to the Boston Strangler, and if he could have done it, was, most people thought he was full of shit. And they dismissed him because of that. Mm-hmm. But there's some reality to what he talked about. Sure, he probably lied a lot.
Yeah.
But the crux of what he said, I think we all find at the end of the day, based on DNA analysis, that, he actually did some of this.
Yeah, for sure.
I think it's proven that he, at least achieved one, and isn't that enough? Mm-hmm. When you compare it to all the other pieces of this and the details. So we'll pause on that one for now, but I just wanted to call that out. Like, here's a moderately good looking guy walking up to, a single woman's apartment saying, put on a leotard, I want to measure you. And then proceeding to, compliment her into bed.
Yeah. So, okay, I did want to ask you about that because he was He was arrested and served 11 months in jail. What was his sentence? Because certainly as he was measuring them, he fondled the women. But it seemed like what
I think he did more than that.
Well, actually, that's what I want to ask you about, because it seemed like what I found was he was actually only convicted of, like, fondling and peeping Tom. I didn't see anything about sexual assault, and fondling could be a type of sexual assault for sure, but that's not what he was charged with. He wasn't charged with sexual assault and rape, I don't think.
Yes. Actually, he was.
He was?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. So he was known as a con man. He was known as a B&E guy.
So you keep saying B&E.
Breaking and entering.
Breaking and entering, that's
my
right.
Fancy lingo.
Yeah.
Crime lingo.
Your
Get with the program.
TCP lingo.
I can't remember anything, so I just say it like that. Here's what a piece of information I got out of biography.com that I thought was interesting here, because this was the first time I had heard exactly what he had done that got him into jail when he decided to confess to the Boston Strangler murders. So it says, after a spell in prison for breaking and entering, DeSalvo went on to commit more serious crimes. He had broken into a woman's apartment, tied her up to a bed, and held a knife on her throat before molesting her and running away. The victim gave the police a good description, one that matched his likeness sketch from his previous crimes, and then shortly thereafter he was arrested. So,
and this was during the measuring man time.
Measuring man / green man time.
Okay.
Yeah. And while he was in jail for these crimes, this is when he confessed. So I find it really interesting because, I mean, he pretty much did the same to these other women that he was successly, as if he was the Boston Strangler, as we, sort of know that he at least committed one of those crimes. It was really this very similar. What's the difference?
Well, it was similar, but I think he went to prison first for the measuring man. Then he was released, and then he became the green man to do the Boston Strangler murders.
This says that he spent time in prison for breaking and entering.
Okay.
And then he must have gotten out.
Yeah, right.
And that's when he did the green man / measuring man. I'm not sure. I don't think there's any, I think that he did the green man rapes and the measuring man rapes. I think he did those at the same time. It was just really, all the only difference was his method.
Got it. Okay. That's probably true.
He was going in as the pink guy who had the green clothes on versus the measuring man who had this whole, I'm going to flatter you and you're going to be a model shenanigans.
That people bought!
End result was the same. So now we'll talk about, when essentially DeSalvo's in jail. He's put in jail for this. He's arrested. This is 1965.
I will say at this point, if you have not listened to the Boston Strangler episode yet, this would be a good time to listen to the Boston Strangler, because we're not going to go through all of the events, the murders of the Boston Strangler again. Most likely they're tied to DeSalvo, which we'll discuss shortly. But if you want to pause here, plop the Strangler episode in the middle, and then come back to talk about the sentence for DeSalvo, that's where we're going now.
Yep. So as we said, DeSalvo was arrested for this, breaking into women's apartment, tying them to the bed, holding a knife on them, molesting them, and running away. So obviously he wasn't going further and killing anyone yet that we know of. It said it was after he had been picked out of an identity parade that DeSalvo admitted to robbing hundreds of apartments and carrying out a couple of rapes. He then confessed to being the Boston Strangler. Now, to me, this isn't a surprise. I am not surprised by women not coming forward and saying that they were raped.
I agree.
If you think about the time, very conservative, the general populace would have judged these women on putting themselves into this situation. They would have probably been blamed for it.
Mm-hmm.
Why did you let him in? Why did you go along with this? Whatever. And it just wasn't something. Even now, people don't.
It still goes unreported a lot of times.
A lot of times, and especially it goes unreported for men. More so men now than women.
Definitely.
At least more women are actually coming out and talking about it. But, it's just terrible to think that people feel like it should be ashamed or embarrassed or will be persecuted or judged for in somehow or another participating in their own rape, which is bananas. So screw you people, for doing that to these folks. But it happens all the time, especially when you're talking about, in a court of law, when you've got a prosecutor, and you've got a defense attorney. Those guys are vicious, and they will absolutely go after the victim and just try to discredit them to ruin their credibility so that they can get their, whoever their guy off that they're trying to defend. So those guys, those people, guys, women, whatever, the very worst kind of people, because anyone who would, try to discredit a victim who had the strength to come forward is just beyond me.
So before he was picked out of a lineup, I want to actually talk about the ensuing event that led to his arrest, or led to him ending up in a lineup.
Okay, got it. Go for it. I have a gap in my information. I would like to know.
I'm excited. I got you on one. Okay, so actually on October 27th, 1964, in Connecticut, so he's actually branching out now, he walked up to a home. This is the oldest trick in the book, guys. Don't fall for this. Knocked on the door and claimed he had car trouble. Then the man who answered clearly didn't believe him, didn't allow him into the home. DeSalvo tried to force his way in and push his way in, and the guy who would go on to be a police chief, Richard Spruills, fired shots at him. They were warning shots. He wasn't trying to actually hit him, but trying to get him outside, get him out of his house. So DeSalvo ran away.
How many times do you think DeSalvo ever approached a house with a man? Why would he do that? It's weird.
I don't know. He may not have known that there was a man there. Unless this is going back to maybe he's de-escalating now and he's just looking for breaking and entering.
I guess, but man, I'm not saying he's a smart guy or anything, but man, you're not going to be as successful if you're dealing with people who aren't vulnerable and that you can't overpower.
Exactly. Now, I think it was that night after this event, DeSalvo went for what seemingly would become the Boston Strangler's last attack, but ultimately wasn't. He went to a woman's home, tied her up, just like the Strangler did, seemingly started to rape her or was going to rape her, then stopped and said, "I'm sorry," and left.
I think that's the one where, she gave a good description and then that's the lineup.
Exactly. And then that's what led to her giving a description leading to the lineup.
Do you recall in any of his, because there, again, as we've already said, DeSalvo confessed to being the Boston Strangler.
Yep.
He gave an extremely detailed and lengthy confession. Do you recall him talking about that at all?
About this incident?
I mean, yes. And the problem with the DeSalvo confession, in my opinion, is that they never released the tapes.
Right.
So let's take a step back for a second. Attorney General Edward Brooke, he had started this task force in 64, because obviously he was getting a lot of pressure to solve this case. He put Assistant Attorney General John Bottomley in charge of the interviews and really the investigation. Bottomley wasn't really a criminal attorney. This wasn't his area of expertise, and he certainly wasn't an expert at interviewing.
He was very unorthodox, is what I read.
Yeah, like he essentially fed information through his questions. And it's said that the reason that he was fully responsible and fully controlled all of the tapes. I think it was 6 hours of tapes. He would only release the transcripts to everyone. He would never release the tapes. I don't even think the tapes exist anymore. There are a couple little pieces that they played in court, but they're so poor quality that they couldn't even really hear him.
Yeah.
The transcripts have a lot of information.
Sure.
But the reason that Bottomley was said to have not wanted the tapes to be heard was because his unorthodox, I'm air quotes, methodologies, was that he was just a really, really crappy interviewer. And that everything about the way that he interviewed DeSalvo gave him information that allowed him to confirm that he was the Boston Strangler. So, essentially he would say, for example, Albert, you have the nylons. What are you going to do with them next? Or when did you put the nylons around her neck?
Very leading.
Yes.
Yeah.
And if we are thinking about if we take out of the picture that DeSalvo is guilty or to some of these crimes, to have a person or a witness a suspect who gets that kind of information makes it really hard to use that confession in the future because 100%. You pretty much told them everything that you want them to answer.
Right.
That's not the way it works. So his unorthodox methodology was that he was just really bad at it.
Okay.
So, and let's take another step back. Well, it's not really a step back. So Albert DeSalvo confesses he's already in jail.
Right.
His cellmate or one of his, peeps.
Yeah, I think it was his cellmate.
George Nassar.
Uh-huh.
Suggest to Albert DeSalvo that he meets his attorney, F. Lee Bailey.
Right.
This is when the suggestion comes from Albert DeSalvo that he wants to write a book about being the Boston Strangler, but he doesn't want to get tried and convicted of the crime. So who else would you ask but F. Lee Bailey? Not surprising here at all. And F. Lee Bailey, of course, supported this idea.
Well,
he said, first off, F. Lee Bailey is like the biggest dick I've ever
okay,
seen.
Literally, I wrote,
Jesus.
F. Lee Bailey, stand-up guy. OJ, Dr. Sam Shepard, and DeSalvo.
Awful.
Uh-huh.
And making money off of this. Like
major millions.
This was said to be F. Lee Bailey's first, financial coup.
Okay.
So not to blow it, but F. Lee Bailey essentially said, yeah, I'll meet with DeSalvo for sure. And F. Lee Bailey was known as he was known even back then as a really good defense attorney. He was incredible at cross-examination.
Uh-huh.
As we see in the OJ trials. I mean, obviously, he's really good at getting people off, when it comes to crimes that they're being, tried for. So F. Lee Bailey meets with DeSalvo, and they construct this plan. And part of this was the reason that George Nassar, in my opinion, really suggested this to DeSalvo was because DeSalvo and George Nassar were actually working together because they thought, they would get the they would get the reward for figuring out who the Boston Strangler was. So they were going to. I'm like, you can't do that for yourself.
You can't turn yourself in and get the reward.
But good old F. Lee Bailey, he helped. He essentially constructed a deal and said, okay, we'll figure out a way to make this work. So what will happen is you're already in jail, dude. They really want to know who the Boston Strangler is.
Right. Apparently
he was in jail. He would have been in jail for long enough that it wouldn't matter. He was already in long enough to where he was going to be there for a while or his life. So he had nothing
Nassar,
to lose.
Are you talking about?
No.
DeSalvo?
Yeah.
Was he really?
Well, he had to have been because why would he have put himself at risk? And he needed immunity.
So, okay. So go ahead, but I'll come back to why I think he might have done that.
Got it. So F. Lee Bailey and DeSalvo worked together. F. Lee Bailey talked to the cops and said, hey, friends, because we're all buddies, I will interview DeSalvo for you.
Right.
And I will tell you whether or not I think he is the Boston Strangler. And so I hate F. Lee Bailey. Like when I watch him in these interviews, I'm just like, you are just, if I have to open the Webster's dictionary and see disgusting attorney, you're it. Because to me, it's so contradictory to what, justice is all about.
Yes.
So, so the police say, okay, well, the only way that, we'll know for sure is if DeSalvo conveys information that only we would know.
Right.
So they gave him, F. Lee Bailey a series of questions and said, talk to DeSalvo, come back with the answers, and then we'll tell you if he's close or not. So F. Lee Bailey did that. Now, I've never heard of a defense attorney trying to prove their person.
Defendant's
Yeah.
guilt.
Yeah. He worked really hard at this, you know.
See, this is actually stuff I didn't see, so I'm glad you're telling me this.
Oh my God.
Okay.
Like, it's the craziest thing. And I don't think you should be allowed to profit from your crimes, for the love of God.
No.
But no, he did,
Seems
you know. And at the end of the day, not to go down that road, but Albert DeSalvo really didn't profit much. F. Lee Bailey did, which is the most disgusting thing.
He's the one that profited the most.
So he reads these questions to DeSalvo. DeSalvo gives the answers. F. Lee Bailey goes back to the cops, says, "Here's your answers." The cops say, pretty close.
Yeah, right.
Right. Not surprising.
Uh-huh.
So then they're like, okay, well, yeah, let's do a deal with this guy. So they went in and they did a much more lengthy, confession with DeSalvo, and they walked through all of the crimes with him. They talked at length. I think they had 6 hours of tape, but they had 6 hours of tape, which turned into thousands of pages of transcripts. A lot of people disagree or as of 2001, disagreed about DeSalvo and whether or not he was the Boston Strangler and participated in any of these crimes. The biggest piece of this was the Sullivan family, who was the family of Mary Sullivan.
Mary Sullivan, who was the Strangler's last victim.
So they felt strongly that they wanted to know because they wanted to make sure that
the right person was
And they actually, I don't know if they worked with the DeSalvo family, but the DeSalvo family also wanted to know, or at least prove his innocence, even though, regardless if he was a Boston Strangler or not, he raped a boatload of people.
I think I know where you're going.
Yes.
But before we get there, before we jump ahead.
Jump in.
So, all the craziness with F. Lee Bailey and him profiting. So, in DeSalvo's confession, he provided details, and I don't know if these are details that he provided to Bailey or if they are details he provided to the detectives.
To the only person he talked to, and nobody else could be in the room,
was F. Lee Bailey.
John Bottomley.
Oh.
No, because he couldn't give his confession to his attorney.
Well, that's what I was thinking. Okay, so John Bottomley.
That's
Mr. Unorthodox.
That's the book that essentially led. So that's what I think the big problem was. John Bottomley screwed up the interview, because I think it would have been a lot more clear whether or not that would have been DeSalvo or not way before 2001.
Probably right, because he essentially provided details that were never released to the public, but then he also contradicted very simple details. So the reason why I said I question why he may have decided to confess is we're gonna jump back to, I don't even remember if it was this episode or the Strangler episode at this point, but the FBI profile about a pretty ordinary guy who's usually a pretty good, nice person, but has instances of rage that just come out. DeSalvo would say in his confession that he would commit the crimes, then go home, watch the crimes on the news be reported, and cry. So,
yeah, in his confessions. So let's go back a little bit. I'll go back to F. Lee Bailey. We'll hold that because I have more thoughts on this. We know for sure he profited, right?
Yeah.
So we'll start there. There was one person in particular, I think it was Patricia Bissett, the one who was found on December 31st, 1962. She was 23.
Yep.
The one who was covered up to her neck.
Correct.
This is the one in Albert DeSalvo's confession that he was the most upset about. And he said specifically, I liked her and she liked me. And she treated me like a man. So he was the most respectful of her. He covered her up. He didn't treat her the way he did the other victims. He still killed her. But he was raped and killed. In the confessions, he cried. He was very upset with himself.
He was extremely emotional.
Yeah. So, obviously that sort of leads me to believe, control issues.
Yes.
Because he's got, obviously, look, we know he's a sociopath. Just his behavior in getting into people's apartments, right?
Diagnosed as a sociopath.
Absolutely. But, and he did know right from wrong. It just sounds like he couldn't control himself. Whether that's because of some of the abuse he suffered, maybe some, prefrontal lobe damage or whatever it is, we know that he escalated and he was torturing animals. So this is consistent behavior for what a serial killer, you would see. But, it's sad that he looked back on it and was sad about it, but it's too bad he wasn't sad enough in the moment to actually stop himself.
Right.
Emotional control is pretty typical when it comes to head trauma.
Yeah.
So, and his dad, I think that his brother had said that his dad had picked him up and shook him a couple times and threw him on the ground and just really threw him around the room when he was when he was young.
Yeah.
So I'm not surprised if he had some damage in those moments.
Yes.
So the Patricia Bissett thing I thought was really interesting.
It is really interesting. All right. So back to, he confesses. He goes to trial and is found not guilty. I think he's found not guilty by reason of mental insanity or defect.
He was never charged with the Boston Strangler crimes.
pretty sure that he was.
No.
Hang on.
He got immunity for confessing.
So after his confession, in 1967, DeSalvo went to prison, or went to trial for the measuring man,
Yes.
for the green man, all of that stuff,
Which were bad enough.
There were
many
terrible.
of them, and
Yes,
then he raped people. So
for sure,
enough to get him in a life in prison.
So
that's the only reason he agreed to this deal, because he was going to be there anyway.
Got it. So he essentially was. So he was found not guilty by reason of insanity initially.
For what?
For the green man, for his sexual assault crimes.
Likely.
Yes. So that was part of the deal that he worked out with F. Lee Bailey and the Boston DA.
Yeah, because F. Lee Bailey told him, you will never stand trial for this. You'll get immunity, and you won't be judged for it either, because you're gonna, even if you do,
right,
you will be safe because you will go to the
right
home for criminally insane.
So he was sentenced to life, not guilty, life to the Boston State Hospital, but then he actually escaped.
Right. Yes.
Yeah, he actually escaped.
Yes.
And then was found, and his conviction was overturned from not guilty by insanity to guilt, and then he was sent to prison.
Yes. So that was, 67, 68, right around there?
Yeah, 67 is when he was found not guilty and went to the state hospital. 68 is when he escaped and then was found and moved to the prison.
Yes. So just to talk a little bit more about F. Lee Bailey and the participation in the catastrophe, because I think Boston felt strongly that they did want to have this crime resolved.
Right.
And apparently Brooks, Edward Brooke and John Bottomley both felt like that they had the right guy based on the information they had. F. Lee Bailey, of course, thought that because he wanted to have a reason to be able to get royalties from a book that Albert DeSalvo would help write, and then ultimately sell his story. And it's said that DeSalvo agreed to this deal because he wanted to make money, not for himself, which is probably true because he couldn't make money for himself, but he could make money to give to his family. So none of that happened. Essentially, as we know, and most of the time when these cases happen with these attorneys, is that their expenses are always paid first, and they're so astronomical that generally the victims get nothing or very little.
Yeah.
So not surprising here. That was exactly what happened. DeSalvo really never got any money. F. Lee Bailey got his royalty moving forward. There was a movie about the Boston Strangler that Tony Curtis was in. There's a ton of books, a ton of documentaries about it. So, DeSalvo became infamous, and even though there were some people who disagreed that this was him, for the most part, I think people wanted to believe that it was. He was off the street, and there weren't any more murders happening.
They stopped. They ended.
Yeah.
Right. So, all right, let's jump to where you were going before. 2001, and the family of Mary Sullivan and the DeSalvo family and how they came together.
Okay, but first, before we do that, I want to talk about DeSalvo, because DeSalvo continues to he's in jail. Yeah. He stays in jail. November 25th, 1973, DeSalvo is stabbed to death in his cell, in his bed. Now, how that happens in a prison where whoever did this would have had to go through six
levels of security.
Yeah, doors.
Right.
Obviously, it's questionable.
Yeah.
People are concerned about that. The other part that's interesting about that is the night before, he had called the head psychiatrist at the prison and told him that he wanted to recant his confession and tell the real story. Now, whether we believe that or not, or did DeSalvo just want more attention, or did he realize that he wasn't going to get it, or he wasn't getting the money that he was promised?
Right.
So now he switches it up.
Yeah.
Now, and of course, I'm sure nobody at that point had really thought about the F. Lee Bailey piece of it, but there was a lot, if Albert DeSalvo did come out and talk to anybody and told the real story, which is that, his attorney essentially worked with him but worked against him at the same time, and this was just a big mess, I'm sure there would have been a lot of bad press for F. Lee Bailey, and there would probably police officers at risk. There were F. Lee Bailey was at risk. There was a lot of people at risk in him talking. So that next morning, he was supposed to talk to the psychologist, and he was found dead instead. So the psychiatrist said he turned on the news, and DeSalvo had been murdered. Whether that has any correlation to anything,
Sure, but interesting.
Probably not.
Probably not.
What I understand
Something
happened.
to think about.
Yeah. What I understand happened to DeSalvo, which could still involve F. Lee Bailey in some way, was that DeSalvo was, as we all know, petty criminal. You know, he tried to get away with a lot of stuff. In jail, it sounds like that he was competing with the mob for selling drugs in prison.
You never want to do that.
Yeah, and so they just took him out.
So it's losing effort.
As simply as that.
Yeah,
you know,
that's probably true.
They didn't need the competition.
That's probably
he had
what happened.
a big mouth. Yeah. He was a bragger. Just shut him up. You know, and if that can help F. Lee Bailey at the same time, or help the police because they're not going to have to hear from DeSalvo again, so be it. So that's 1973. So now moving on into July of 1999, which is 6 years later, the Boston police reopened the case, hoping to use DNA technology to analyze. So now to year 2000, when the DeSalvo family and the Sullivan family both sue to be able to get to that evidence.
Right.
Because there was, in 99, they did do a DNA test, and they found that there was they couldn't identify DeSalvo as the Boston Strangler based on the DNA testing they did at that time.
Right. And at that time, and of course, based on DNA testing from evidence that they had from the original crimes, right?
Right.
Yeah. So when they were brought together, though, I don't think I took it as though it was a writer who essentially turned investigator that brought the Sullivan and DeSalvo families together to try and reopen this case.
It's probably true.
And
anybody who tells the story has that's their incentive.
Well, that's their incentive, money. but I guess what I'm saying is I don't know that these families got there on their own.
No, I agree with you. So in 2000, essentially the Mary Sullivan's remains were exhumed for DNA testing. They did some DNA testing, and they found some correlation between the DNA that they found on Mary Sullivan and the an ancestor of DeSalvo. So then they exhumed DeSalvo's, and they tested, his DNA. And
in 2013, right?
Yes. 2001, DeSalvo's body was exhumed. And then the forensic scientists announced that the DNA evidence taken from the Sullivan's body did not match DeSalvo. So they exhumed Sullivan and DeSalvo both in 2001, and that's when they found that they didn't match. It was 2013 where they went through this again, and they actually tested the DNA from the crime scene and not just from the DNA from Mary Sullivan when they exhumed her the first time.
Got it.
So they found a familial match. It sounds like that they had either found the familial match with DeSalvo's nephew or his son.
And the source was seminal fluid that was maintained and retrieved from the original crime scene.
Right. And it appears DeSalvo, the Boston Strangler, the seminal fluid that they found wasn't actually in their vaginas. It was on their face.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, you're right.
Which I think is kind of whatevs.
I agree.
All right. So there we have it. So here's what I think.
Yeah.
I think that Albert DeSalvo was the Boston Strangler.
Okay.
I think that for a couple of reasons. Number one, the murder stopped when he went to jail. The other reason I think that is because we have proof, DNA proof, that he, obviously was
Mary Sullivan. He murdered Mary Sullivan.
That's 100% guaranteed.
Yes.
So when anybody else says, tries to break this case down and they say, the details weren't there in the confession. When he confessed to the Mary Sullivan murder, the details in that confession were also wrong. He did not have all the details correct.
No, he didn't. You're right.
So then if you think about him, I mean, and we know he did that one.
Yes.
I'm not surprised that he got the details wrong. First off, it's a lot of information, 6 hours of tape. He'll pretty much agree to anything.
You'll agree to anything at that point. And also, he did a lot. I think he did a lot of crimes that did not involve being the Boston Strangler. I mean, I think he was continuing to do the measuring man and sexual assaults that didn't always lead to deaths and murder. So he did a lot of crimes that were probably running through his head that didn't always deal with murder.
Yeah, I agree with you. It's wow. I mean, it's crazy, to think that. But I think that sort of speaks a lot to, if you think about, like I said, his confession and his inability to get his own crimes wrong, that at least one of them we know he committed, then what does that make? What is that for all the other confessions in the world?
No, I agree.
And how much do people remember? I mean, there's a, that happened over a couple of years. I'm not surprised he got some of it wrong. And what we don't know, and unless you look at the transcripts, is he got a significant amount of the details right.
He got most of the details right, and key
things
details.
Yeah, exactly.
Yep.
Things that he knew about the items that were under furniture.
Yeah.
It would have been impossible unless he put them under the furniture for him to be able to talk about this.
Yeah.
So the other pieces of it, sure. I'm not surprised that everything wasn't exactly accurate, especially if these were acts of rage, because you're probably little blacked out or a little, off at that point. But I mean, wow.
I think he did it. There are some theories as to who the other people are, particularly people that may have had the opportunity to benefit from it. But I really do think it was him. Even though some of the MOs were different, some of the victims varied widely. If he didn't do all of them, I think he was at least responsible for a solid majority of them.
Yeah. The other thing that throws people off, and, I'll tell you what I sort of heard from, the information from the transcripts. What throws a lot of people off is that he picked older victims at first.
Right, exactly.
And when he was asked about that, like, if this was a sexual crime or, whatever.
Why older victims?
Why older victims, were and what he said, and he was very frank about it, wasn't about being attracted to them. And so it didn't really matter.
No, that
it was
made
about
no
vulnerability.
Yeah.
So the time when he
makes
moved,
sense.
yeah, because he sort of got confidence when he had all these older people that he was able to successfully murder. And then he moved into Sophie, right?
Right.
The first young victim.
Right.
There was a break there. I also think that his insatiable sexual appetite, I feel like if I knew and I couldn't find a lot of information on his relationship with his wife. And even I couldn't even find a lot of information about his kids.
Yeah.
But my thoughts are, and some people suggested this, that he was acting out and his triggers were based on his wife being pregnant and his ability to, have sex with her. And so in the moments where they weren't happy together or they were arguing or whatever, these were lag moments where he actually went back to, the Boston Strangler methodology.
That's kind of what I thought too.
Yeah. So not surprising, but
you're right though. There's not a lot out there about his family.
No.
I tried. Yeah. So
crazy, but
that's
we know that Albert Henry DeSalvo killed at least one of the victims that were part of the Boston Strangler victims. So the likelihood of him being the person who committed the other crimes is probably pretty high.
All right. Well, I think we're going to wrap up this second part of our 2-part about the Boston Strangler and Albert DeSalvo.
I just want to mention, by the way, that we did this episode because Brittney suggested it because she knew that her dad was excited about this. So
my dad asked me to do this episode. He's been asking me for months, and actually he asked me at least 4 or 5 times. And then when I told him that I was going to be recording this weekend, he said, "Oh yeah, what are you going to do?" I said, "It's the one you've been asking me about." Oh, are you doing Jack the Ripper?
Oh, good Lord. I love Jack the Ripper.
I know you do, so I told him I'm sure that one's coming down the line.
Well, thanks, Dad, for not remembering that you suggested this, but here's for you.
All right. Of course, give credit to our sources. Serial Killers Podcast, Sonia mentioned, History.com, Wikipedia, Murderpedia, Encyclopedia Britannica,
Biography.com,
Daily Telegraph,
Gen Y Podcast,
the Crime Weekly docuseries.
The list goes on and on.
Oh, yeah, we got a lot of them.
Yeah.
And, I'm going to leave you with a little piece of lighthearted / facepalm news. Because in 1971, someone in the Texas legislature on April 1st, no less, as an April Fool's joke, opened a resolution to honor Albert DeSalvo for his work in population control.
What?
It passed the Texas legislature.
No fucking way.
I swear
Are
to you.
you for real?
Uh-huh.
Texas. What the? Okay, we're ending there.
Yep.
Signing off. Thanks, everybody.
Stilettos.
Thanks, Texas.
Thanks to Scarlet TCP for the amazing episode. Check out the links in the show notes to subscribe. Thanks again for listening to True Crime by Indie Drop-In. If you would like your show featured, reach out to us at Indie Drop-In on all social media or go to indiedropin.com. See you next time.